You're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of the 5th studio album by Slowdive. I'm someone that grew up as a shoegaze kid, and the holy trinity of shoegaze, which emerged at the end of the 80s and start of the 90s as a distinct genre loosely based around a holy trinity of RIDE, Slowdive and My Bloody Valentine. And all those bands pretty much ended with the music press turning on Slowdive and celebrating Britpop and killing Slowdive dead by about 1994, forcing those bands into either hibernation, either willfully or because they were My Bloody Valentine and wouldn't have released another album for 27 years anyway, or like RIDE, forcing them into Britpop and doing their worst music. And in Slowdive's case, just sort of dissipating. And the interesting part of that is that a lot of music genres, and I always point to like garage and two-step, that get killed off very quickly, end up being the ones that win. Because I would never listen to a Britpop act ever again. I'm not going to put Part Life on, or definitely Maybe on. I'm still going to listen to the albums by My Bloody Valentine, Slowdive and RIDE. But the point is that all three of those bands, after 20 years hiatus, came back around like 2015 on with tours and albums, which was amazing, and they were all good. I saw all on tour, and I saw and the albums were actually really, really good. The RIDE albums, who were my favourite of the whole bunch, were perhaps not as great as their peak period, but overall the fact that their live show was really strong and that they weren't relying on past glories at all, I thought made them the most interesting. My Bloody Valentine's album was excellent and sort of half put his foot in the past, 1/3 in the past, 1/3 in the present, and 1/3 looking at a future version of My Bloody Valentine, which is fascinating. Slowdive were the ones that actually recreated their 1993 past, and probably with the best album. But do you celebrate that, even though RIDE's album wasn't as good, but they tried something so new, and Slowdive really did repeat what they did in the past with a brilliant album called Slowdive, their 4th album. And since then, it's been a holding pattern for pretty much everyone involved. And Slowdive have come back 5 years, 6 years later with Everything Is Alive, their new album, their 5th. And RIDE is still going strong. I don't think they get the credit they deserve. They just did their well-earned Nostalgia Circuit 30th Anniversary Nowhere tour. And they're great on stage now. They really are. Their albums just need a tick up from a 7 to an 8 out of 10. And ironically, Slowdive, whose album was so much less impressive but much better, this time around seem to have gone down the RIDE route of not being quite pushing enough in the right direction. In the interim of Slowdive becoming this huge force for good again, I mean, this year, Paranol, I gave, I think, a 9 out of 10 to. Their first album was totally in love with shoegaze, but also two really prominent bands, Dive and Beach House, pulling out the dream pop / shoegaze genre into the modern era. And it's a really strong era. You're not seeing Britpop analogous bands now at all. So we've got Rachel Goswell, and the queen of shoegaze, I guess, and what's his face? Neil. Sorry, I'm going to have to look his name up again. Neil Halstead, the primary songwriters and singers in this band. This album isn't comparable to me to the self-titled 4th album, which was absolutely fucking brilliant. The opening track, ironically, does remind me, Cool Shanty does remind me of RIDE, and how RIDE have employed synths or arpeggiators, sometimes too politely, and that's what happens here. It sounds great for a few minutes, and then it's a little bit drifty. And the same complaint I've had with RIDE's more modern music is that the guitars could be louder and more fuzzed out. And it drifts into this like dive doing the Cure, where it's this like descending motifs all the time, and it does get a little bit sort of Pink Floyd, but not in a good way, and a little bit slight. And the same for the second track as well. Although it's a little bit more melodically compelling, it's still slight. It's an instrumental, and I think a lot of these tracks, the vocals aren't ever strong enough that they would be missed. It's very, very pretty and never thrilling. I thought the third track, A Life, was the most interesting tangent they do on this album, which was make me think of Chromatic's Kill for Love, my second favourite album of the last decade. And that was nearly a standout track. Also a sort of Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper vibe. The first really prominent male vocal Andalusia plays has a very sort of world-weary feel that inhabits the whole album. And a tiny bit analogous to Sparkle Horse. I just reviewed the Sparkle Horse album again, and The Cure, which comes up a fair bit. But like a lot of songs on here, I don't know why they're as long as they are, and I don't know why this one's 7 minutes long. It doesn't modulate or change enough, or I just wish they'd come out and just go nuts for a few minutes in a song on this album, instead of letting everything be very, very polite in the same pocket as the first 2 minutes. There's not really any, the last 3 minutes, everything went really interesting. It's pretty much the opening 2 minutes with less vocal. Again, Ride, Peer Up on Kisses. It just needs more of everything on virtually every track on here. The soundstage is too simple and too repeated throughout. The same instruments, the same sort of very slight drum beat. Everything is slight. And by track 6, Skin in the Game, it's just a bit too similar in tone and mood. And there's a little bit of fatigue for me. If I'm listening to it in the background, it's a really nice album, but if I'm actually reviewing it and listening to each track throughout, I've felt fatigue. And I've had these albums that I'm reviewing now for well over a month, so it's not like I've heard it once. Change to the Cloud almost felt like it was going to be the track that actually lifted, and it's got some like one of the few instrumental things on here I like was the fact that the synths in the background, the trancey synths, really add to stuff. Very beach house, this one. But again, it doesn't quite nail it. It might be my favourite track, and the Slab, the last track, is another one that just sort of interminably represents the opening minute throughout its duration without modulating in any direction or offering anything that's that compelling melodically. So I feel like this is there was a crossover point when the Slowdive comeback album came out in 2017, which is Beach House continually make, like War on Drugs, they continually make a brilliant album, slightly better or different each time. And at that point, a Beach House album and the Slowdive comeback album were equals. But there's no way that this is the equal of any of the Beach House albums. It is far too inconsequential. It does remind me of lesser dive tracks a lot. And also, it's not as good as the two comeback Ride albums, which actually show a lot more sonic invention and melodic invention throughout than this does. This is like one track and 8 different variants of it. It's only 41 minutes long, and most of the tracks are on average approaching 5 minutes, so it's not a massive album. And there is a well-weary vibe that sort of drags it down a lot. So I'm really sorry to say, even though they're one of the holy trinity of Shoegaze, and their comeback album was absolutely magnificent and arguably the best of the trio. I would say out of the 5 albums involved, this is the worst, including the MBV, the 2 Ride and the 2 Slowdive. I'd put this bottom. So I'm sorry to say that I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 5 for Slowdive, and the Everything is Alive isn't a particularly representative title